celebrate with me the bicentennial of the 1820 settlers, 200 years ago. And it's quite a special occasion, and I'm not sure I'm up to helping us commemorate this. Most of our talks this year are going to be on the 1820 settlers for this reason. I'm going to need these spectacles. Okay, this is, he's acknowledged as the founder of our port city. 200 years down the line, we don't see ourselves as settlers, really, do we? We South Africans. The term settler is something of a political barb these days. Yet here I am, sticking my head above the parapet and proudly acknowledging that 3 of my grandparents were descended from 1820 settlers. After all, everyone, wherever they are, is a settler, and I'm sure we'd all agree with that. There's another point I want to make tonight, and that is, I think we all feel ambivalent about whether history should be rewritten, should history be revised, or is it cast in stone? To some extent, my presentation will show that the deeper one delves, the more mistakes we find these esteemed historians have made. And in my opinion, it's abundantly clear history can always do with a bit of revision. Just forget the politics and hunt down the truth. 50 years ago, the Coelacanth, Volume 8, Number 2, was celebrating the settlers, funny enough, 150th anniversary. And Margaret Rainier, who some of us will remember, had an article, Some Prominent 1820 Settlers, and John Bailey is discussed quite extensively in that. And the other article that also touches on John Bailey in this Coelacanth was written by H.H. Driffield, whose book Pioneer Port is much sought after Afrikaner today. And they tell a lot of the John Bailey history that I'm going to give you tonight. So it's nothing new, we're just boring old history, but we try and make it fun, you know, you've got to get some fun out of history. And I think that John Bailey certainly is worth a closer look. The man credited with planting the Union Jack on Signal Hill, thus becoming the founder of East London in November 1836, was recognised by the city fathers a century later with an impressive memorial on that site. About the same time, a prominent road from the Esplanade through Bunkers Hill up to Gleneagles Road was named after him as the suburbs expanded to the east. Now, if you go back, that is the proper spelling of Bailey. And there's the Gleneagles intersection, and that's how we're spelling John Bailey today, which is wrong, so we need to do some revision there. The road parallel to John Bailey Road is called Hope Drive, and there is a connection which will become clear. This is Mark Taylor's mention of the founding of East London and the raising of the flag in Town on the River, and that was in 1947 or 8 when the centenary of East London was celebrated, and he designed the pageant presentation on the occasion. There is, thanks to William for these slides, this is the memorial on Signal Hill at next to the Harbour Portmaster's office, and it's well preserved because it's well fenced off and there's security. And this plaque was modelled by Mr. Hugo Bodie in 1937. And it's interesting that Lieutenant John Bailey, Royal Navy, just bear that in mind. John Bailey's life deserves a closer look. He was a talented, industrious, and often tragic character. John was born in 1788 in Ongole in Madras to Thomas Bailey and his wife Anne Hope. Hope Drive, Anne Hope. Now, I just want to interrupt myself. If you go and look up John Bailey in the Dictionary of South African Bibliography, which is a much esteemed publication, it says he was born in Angola. Ongole, Angola. Both his parents' families were well connected. The Baileys were minor Irish landed gentry. I thought of raising funds and raffling a bottle of Irish Bailey's cream tonight, but decided against it. The Hopes were eminent in the legal profession of Scotland. The family returned to England about 1790 when John was aged 2. So he was born about a year before the French Revolution. So that gives you a concept of the times that we're talking about. You know, every 10 years the world's a different place. I mean, think of what we have today that we didn't have 10 years ago. Load shedding. But the French Revolution, when you think of our school set work books, was prehistory, it wasn't history. But John Bailey was born just before that. His father fled to France when John was 10 in 1798 to avoid arrest as an Irish revolutionary. The family joined him there a year later and returned to England after 6 years, when John now was 17, when his father was arrested by the French police under suspicion of being a spy for the British government. Of course, Napoleonic Wars, big time. Maybe he was, who knows. His father, he was released without trial 2 years later in 1807, and Thomas Bailey died in London, not at Waterloo, in 1814, when the same year that Napoleon met his fate at Waterloo. Now, according to Margaret Nash, whose thesis, the 1820 Settlers Party of Bailey's 1820 Settlers Party, published in 1982, to whom I credit most of the references tonight, because I consider her references are very good. Contrary to popular tradition, John Bailey never served in the Royal Navy. So, Royal Navy, cast in bronze. He himself claimed he was bred to the sea in the merchant service. A total difference. Age 21, he married Amelia Kraus from Kent in 1809. They had 5 sons, the last of whose name, Morris, slips away from the lists of the settlers in 1819, so he probably died in infancy. John studied law after his mother's tradition, family's tradition, and in 1814, aged 26, joined the civil service, appointed secretary to a government commission arising from the Napoleonic Wars, settling claims for damages arising from the wars. He held this post for 5 years until he resigned to lead a party of emigrants in 1819. John headed a party of 84 men and their families, and some say this was the largest of the settler families. They were all independent settlers. It was constituted on a joint stock basis, but although they planned to all work in this allotment, before they landed in Algoa Bay, they discovered that they weren't suited to each other, and this party was sort of already breaking up. Their ship, the Chapman, was the first settler ship to arrive in Algoa Bay. Can you see that? On the 9th of April 1820. So the first settler ship to arrive. Bailey was granted a farm near the Fish River mouth, which he named the Hope, where he built what was called the best and most substantial farmhouse in the settlement. He lived there until 1832, when he moved to Grahamstown and established a general agency business. In May 1821, now this is the industrious man. In May 1821, he was one of the founders of the Cowie River Navigation Company. I'm not sure they did much, but he was there with the boys. In 1822, he received a permit to survey the coast from Port Elizabeth to the Buffalo River. Now that's interesting. That's 2 years after the settlement, and we know that there was this supposed to be no man's land, the ceded territory, and Ye was getting a permit to go and explore the coast. In 1825, he navigated a decked boat, so not just an empty hull, it had a deck, called the Thomas, into the Great Fish River, where he took soundings, and he also took soundings in the Kaskrama River mouth in 1825. And another thing that illustrates that he was an esteemed member of the community, lawyer, he arbitrated the dispute between Piet Retief and the government. I think there were many disputes between Piet Retief and the government, but for those of you with Grahamstown connections, Rhodes University, I think, is built on what were the barracks of military barracks built by Piet Retief, and he wasn't paid, or he didn't do a good enough job or something. That was the dispute. Bailey was the ref there, the arbitrator. With his sons, Bailey performed commando duties after cattle raids. And during the Mfekane disturbances, he went to Mbolompo under Major Dundas. In 1828, there's a rather famous Battle of Mbolompo. Mbolompo was where the airport in Mthatha and the Mthatha Dam is now. And this is a historians rage over this, because the colony thought Shaka was coming to attack everyone, and hence this raid, and Somerset got involved, but that's a digression. His eldest son Charles, at some point, was called up to serve as a special constable to arrest an outlaw, Fletcher. I don't think any relation to the late British consul, but anyway. When the outlaw raised his gun aimed at a fellow constable, Charles shot him. The ball broke Fletcher's arm and glanced off and accidentally killed him. Charles Bailey, a young man, insisted on being tried by the circuit court judge, who honourably acquitted him and highly praised his conduct. However, That wasn't much help to Charles because he was severely affected by that episode and he became very deeply religious. Him and his wife set up a school that was a sort of evangelizing people in the area, all at their own expense. By 1834, Bailey had prospered to the extent of owning 3 farms in Albany. The homesteads of all 3, the Hope, Harewood, and Leighton, went up in flames, and all their stock was driven off in December 1834 and January 1835, at the beginning of the 6th Frontier War. The family plunged from prosperity to destitution. I don't think 185 years later we have any concept of the calamity that war was. And that war was a total shock to these settlers who certainly didn't expect that, and was the source of bitterness and hatred that lasted for more than a century. John and his son, to support their family, were commissioned captain and lieutenant in the Provisional Colonial Infantry. Charles acted as chaplain to the troops. He was still suffering from that incident, preaching to them in the ruined chapel of Butterworth in May 1835. Now this is soon after, or just before, Hintsa was killed on the banks of the Ngabacha River. Charles then conducted a service in King Williamstown on Sunday the 21st of June 1835, very shortly before being ordered out on patrol around Ntabakandoda with his friend Lieutenant Biddulph. The Biddulph family was one of the families in the Bailey party, so they'd been shipmates. He failed to rendezvous with his old friend Lieutenant Biddulph the next day at Ntabakandoda near Fort White. After nearly 4 months, on the 13th of October, Captain John Bailey identified his son's remains by the prominent hair and whiskers. That's how I knew it was Charles. They lay alongside the Mesha stream. The party had been ambushed and cut down to a man. There's a lot of detail. The Bible was recovered and this and that was recovered. But we can't digress too much. This is the Charles Bailey Memorial today, erected not long ago by Tok H. But that's where his father buried him. This memorial is on the turn of to Kaskamahuk, just beyond Dimbaza. After the war, John Bailey persuaded the authorities. He was obviously in the headquarters tent mess or something. He was officer and with Smith and Durban. He persuaded the authorities of the suitability of the Buffalo River mouth as a port for the new province of Queen Adelaide. He established a reception depot and a convoy of wagons to convey supplies to King Williamstown. The Stinkwood brig Neisner, owned by George Rex and captained by John Findlay, arrived in November 1836 and successfully discharged its cargo. This is, I think, a Thomas Baines picture of Buffalo River. Am I in the way? I don't know if that comes out clearly there. And there's Time in the River, where Mark Taylor, one of our founders, wrote extensively about this. and successfully discharged its code. Hence arose the name of Port Rex. Now, Mark Taylor himself thought that history should be revised a bit and worthy of that, because when you read this page in there, now I don't expect you can read it, but he comes with a whole lot of theories of why there's a bit of nonsense involved with that story. So we'll never really know the truth. In 1837, the Provisional Colonial Infantry was disbanded. Bailey was granted land on the east bank of the Buffalo River, where we are now. Imagine, have a big farm. But his intention to settle there never materialized. Of course, Queen Adelaide Province was abandoned on the 31st of December 1836. So, his next task, in July 1839, he was appointed secretary to the Port Elizabeth Jetty Company. And he supervised the building of that jetty. There's a significant little aspect here. In 1840, on the 20th anniversary of the settlers, now we're exponential, 200 years later, on the 20th anniversary, the settlers, prominent citizens, got together in Algoa Bay and held a fancy luncheon, and certain dignitaries gave an address. And John Bailey was one of the people who addressed this. And it's important to note what he said. He addressed the luncheon celebration of the laying of the jetty foundation stone, which marked the 20th anniversary of the settlers' arrival, in terms which emphasized the good relations between the settlers and Boers. And I quote him, "I am confident that within and without the present boundary of the colony, there exists but one wish with one heart, that however or by whom we may ultimately be governed, from Delagoa Bay to the Cape of Good Hope, there should neither be Boer or settler, but Afrikaners all." That was John Bailey in 1840. In May 1844, John left the colony to join his third son, Thomas, who had settled among the emigrant Boers in the Caledon River district. Now, I never realized that. I thought that the Great Trek was sort of exclusive preserve for Boers. But what you don't realize, and starts coming out when you think about it, there were a lot of settlers who went along with this lot because of that war and continual theft. A few months later, the Grahamstown Journal published a letter from John Bailey which incurred the resentment of the Boer farmers. Both John and Thomas were brought before the elected commandant, the Veld Cornet Jacobus du Plooy of Roodepoort, to answer a charge of malicious libel, as well as an action for damages brought by a trader named MacDonald. Both Baileys were heavily, and they felt illegally fined. Now here's the lawyer, John Bailey, the receiving end of some injustice he felt. Although he appealed to them, neither the colony nor Moshesh would help them. So he has Chief Moshesh involved. So on the 8th of July, 1845, they visited Deploy to demand redress. Well, a quarrel ensued and Deploy was shot dead. John took the money he considered owing to him and rode to Colesberg to report that he had acted in self-defense. They were arrested for murder and robbery, and feelings against them ran so high in Colesberg the trial had to be moved to Uitenhage. And on the 30th of March, 1846, they were found guilty and sentenced to death. Now, what I did was I went to Grahamstown, to the Corey Museum and the Corey Library and Albany Museum, and hunted down in the Grahamstown Journal for this letter, and I eventually found it. I actually don't think it's going to come up clearly there, and it's newspaper that you've got to treat delicately. You can't put in a photocopier, so you take a photophone, and it's not so clear. But it's quite lengthy, but I'm not sure if you are interested in me reading that letter, because this is what caused major problems in this man's life. If it gets a bit boring, just tell me to shut up. So this is the Grahamstown Journal. Can you see that? Not really, eh? 14th of May, 1844. In the course of my perambulations, I fell in with the following document, a copy from the original now before me. At the request of Isaac van Niekerk, late of Port Natal, I gave him these presents to certify that he has been duly discharged from custody in reference to a charge of inducing soldiers to desert preferred against him at Port Natal, it having appeared to me expedient not to bring him to trial for the said alleged offence given under my hand this 13th of January 1843, William Porter, Attorney General. Now that's not Bailey's words, that's the Attorney General, and Bailey's quoting this in a letter to the Grahamstown Journal as an example of expediency by the authorities. What is he saying? Is he libeling the Boers? Who's he libeling? What's he doing? But he goes on to say, how do you like the application of the word expedient? Question mark. I arrived on the banks of the so-called Orange River on the 14th of May at Buffelsvlei Drift and found 9 trek wagons waiting for the river to fall as it was full. On the same day, 20 were waiting at the sand drift. Besides that, were waiting to cross when I arrived, 17 ox wagons, 1 horse wagon, and 1 cart for horses have passed where I now am all trekking. Bear in mind that this is the smallest trek path. 2 wagons that passed had only 8 oxen each. He goes on and on and on, giving details. He then says that these people are very poor, they have hardly any servants. Some of them, their children are bringing out parents from the colony into the emigrant Orange, across the Orange Trans-Ranger. And he mentions that they might have not money for anything else, but they've all got big kegs of gunpowder. Is that a libelous thing? So and it goes on and on. But he says, in one trek I saw a father hale and active with fine grown-up sons, all well armed. They are well off and not far from where I at present am. Some go on to secure adequate places before they move further. The treaty with Moshesh and Koch will, I'm afraid, occasion many to move on. They don't like this British interference. From a sense of insecurity from the interference of the British government. The coloured chiefs must be very cautious how they interfere with the Boers under these treaties, or they will, with their tribes, disappear from the surface of the earth, of Africa. Much depends on the prudence and extreme caution of government. Rash and harsh measures will everywhere be productive of mischief. You know, I can't see anything in that letter that caused the death of Deploy or the harassment. Is that the whole truth? Who will ever know? There's the whole letter there. So, yeah. In September, following a spate of Eastern Province memorials, their sentences were commuted to life imprisonment with hard labour. They were transferred to the convict station at George. Now, if any of you are interested in travelling these old Thomas Baines mountain passes, they were built by convict labour, and Thomas Baines supervised those stations and all that. So there was our esteemed 1820 settler on a hard gang chain labour. This case was a huge embarrassment for Governors Maitland and Pottinger. But for Sir Harry Smith, who knew the guy from 1835, he granted them a free pardon the day he reached Grahamstown on the 17th of December 1847. Widow Deploy is alleged to have provided fresh evidence that they had indeed acted in self-defense. You wonder what had made a change of mind. Now, what I've also got, in looking for that letter, I found later comment by Robert Godlington in the Grahamstown Journal, and he gave the Deploy, before sentence was passed, when there was uproar in the colony, he gave the version by the Deploy family of what happened, and the version not of Bailey, but of Bailey's pals, of what happened. Now, that is quite interesting. And it's not for the squeamish. And again, I don't think it's going to come up too nicely there, but the Grahamstown Journal was about 4 pages, and the sort of main editorial was the news, and it was in about page 3 or 4. Country to the northeast, in other words, of the colony, Orange Free State. The death of the late Field Cornet Deploy by the hands of J&T Bailey affords an instance among many that while justice, but too common across our north-east boundary, there every man has done what was right in his own eyes. That country has been the refuge for all who were disaffected, in debt or embarrassment, deserters from the army, fraudulent debtors, fugitive criminals, and restless seditionists have mingled there with the stream of emigration. Godlington at his best. And no wonder, therefore, at the scenes of violence which have been presented, or the lawless proceedings which have taken place on the very threshold of the colony. That case of J&T Bailey is a strong instance in point, and will, we trust, arouse our government to the necessity of putting forth that power which may suppress such disgraceful proceedings in future. To many of our readers, the elder Bailey is well known as the head of the first and largest party of the Albany, that's where it comes from, largest party of the Albany emigrants of 1820. He has been a rather prominent character on this frontier ever since his arrival in the colony. He is known as a man of respectable family, of good education, of considerable address and talent, but it is not necessary we should carry our personal allusions further, and hence we refer at once to his removal across the colonial boundary in 1844. Various reasons conduced to this, the chief being a desire to join his third son. Of his intention to remove the writer, this was apprised shortly before his departure, and a few weeks subsequently he wrote the letter that got him into all that trouble that ends with productive or mischief. Then Godwin says, it will be perceived that there is nothing in this communication which any individual entertaining friendly feelings to the Boers, as well as attachment to his own country, might not have written. And yet the result shows the lawless violence to which those who ventured to express their honest sentiments on the state of affairs across the boundary were constantly exposed. Now, this document, which gives a key to the whole melancholy affair, was unfortunately torn up only about a month ago, but the fragments have been sought for and so far recovered as to enable us to give his own case. Well, that enabled Godwinton to edit out of this letter what he didn't want to say. The following is transcribed from the original paper before us, the letter which you inserted in your journal, but it's interesting of the names that are mentioned here. This is Godwinton being libelous. The letter which you inserted in your journal was discovered to be mine by the certificate which Archibald Miller, Miller, whom you may remember as a clerk to Edward Norton, probably in Grahamstown, saw in my house, and by him I was denounced to the Boers as having made statements injurious to them. Part of manuscript lost. They proceeded to great extremities, cited me to appear before them, took my people prisoners, sold my property for cash to meet their bill of expenses, refused that their secretary should give me any copy of their records, refused me a bill of costs, or to furnish me with any account of the money so paid. My statement is, manuscript lost, to whom I have ... Until I know the result, it would be premature to publish a word on the subject. This is before he's sentenced to death. The whole thing, in fact, before he's even shot Deploy, the whole thing, were I not a sufferer, would amuse me, who like to study the animal man in every state. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. I can assure you the government will be obliged to cross the Rubicon soon, as they are again talking about Barkans all along the river. Now, Godwin says, how true the latter part of this communication was proved, we have since had abundant evidence. But to return to the unfortunate writer, it appears that not being able to obtain redress for the personal outrage and plunder of his property, he proceeded at length to the residence of Deploy, the chief actor in the illegal violence, accompanied by his son. Both, as appears to be the custom in that country, well armed. A detail of the incident which follows have been given to the authorities at Colesberg by the relatives of Deploy. And then this is what the Deploys state, and have been prematurely published in some other newspaper. So Godwinton feels he's got to also bring it to the public. The matter rested until the morning of the 8th of July. Now this gets pretty gruesome. When John Bailey, accompanied by his son Thomas, the former armed with a brace of pistols and the latter with a double-barreled gun, rode up to Deploy's residence. Their being armed in the present unsettled state of affairs over the river caused no suspicion. Deploy asked them to off-saddle, which they refused. They shook hands, and Deploy asked them to walk up to the house, which they did, leaving the man still working at the wagon. This must be the witness reporting. Mrs. Deploy and one of her daughters were the only persons in the house. Deploy desired their daughter to get some coals to warm the visitors, as it was cold. Thomas Bailey stood at the front door of the house while John Bailey walked inside. Deploy asked him to sit down, but he said he had no time. And at the same moment, he took a sheet of paper out of his pocket and said he had a letter from His Excellency the Governor, desiring that he, Deploy, should pay him £200 damages for the arrest of his person and sale of his goods in November last, or otherwise he was authorized to seize him and take him prisoner to Colesberg. The letter purporting to be from the governor, he said, was unfortunate in English, but he would read it over in Dutch, which he did. Du Plooy asked if he had come to take him prisoner. Bailey replied, "I am the man to do so." Du Plooy, upon this, went into his bedroom to fetch his gun to defend himself, and just as he was taking the holster off, John Bailey discharged a pistol in his left side. The ball entered about the fifth rib and lodged somewhere internally. Du Plooy cried out, "Oh God, help me." Put down his gun and went back into the house. When John Bailey said something in English to his son Thomas, who immediately discharged one barrel of his gun, the ball entering the right side of the head and making its exit at the back of the neck. Du Plooy fell down dead upon the floor. The wife and daughter rushed out of the house and cried out that the Baileys had murdered him, and the man working at the wagon, on coming towards the house, was threatened with death if he attempted to interfere, and he went to fetch his horse to give information to the nearest neighbour. John Bailey went outside and reloaded the pistol and Thomas Bailey his gun, and while the widow was crying and mourning outside, John Bailey threatened to shoot her unless she instantly gave him the money, as he had no time to spare. The affrighted woman gave up the key of the box and desired her daughter to open it and let them take as much as they liked. And while the corpse of Du Plooy was weltering in its blood on the floor, John Bailey counted out a number of sovereigns, put them into his pocket, and desired he might have pen and paper to grant a receipt for the same. He was supplied, and horrid to relate, he gave a receipt for Rix dollars 1,500 or Rix dollars 2,000, written on the paper stained with the blood of the deceased, and then both rode away to their farm situated a few miles off. On Saturday morning, 2 witnesses who inspected the body gave information at the clerk of the peace's office in Colesberg. And while inquiring into the matter, who should appear but John Bailey himself, who said he had come to give information of the death of a farmer in self-defense. The clerk of the peace then applied for a warrant of committal for further examination on a charge of murder and robbery, and a warrant for the apprehension of Thomas Bailey on a charge of murder, both of which applications were granted. Bailey asked to be allowed the use of pen, ink and paper while in jail, and the jailer was desired to allow it. Bailey was then taken over to the jail, apparently quite reconciled, and in fact said he only expected it. He was asked if he had any witnesses he wished examined for his defense. He said he had only his son Thomas. The clerk of the peace replied a warrant had been granted for his apprehension as a principal. Bailey replied he was sorry his son should be implicated in the case, as he was the cause of everything. Now then, Godlington tries to put his spin on this. In publishing this statement, we deem it necessary to remind the reader that it is ex parte, that it indicates great excitement and exaggeration, and it bears the impress of incredibility, and that it is entirely opposed to everyone's ideas of the character, temper, and conduct of the accused. The details are, we believe, the substance of depositions to be made by the family connections of the unfortunate deceased, and we repeat, are too shocking, considering who are the parties accused, to obtain credence without strong corroboratory evidence. Then he quotes the Bailey version. His Bailey statement is very different from the evidence given. I now understand that Bailey and his son were sitting with Du Plooy. Young Bailey left the house for a few moments when Du Plooy immediately sprang upon John and threw him down. It was then Bailey drew his pistol and fired. the sound, Thomas came in and, seeing his father down, immediately fired his gun at deploy. We give this extract purely to neutralize the mischievous impression which the former statement is calculated to have upon all who may peruse it. You have totally different versions. We offer no comment upon the case, awaiting that full investigation which public justice demands should be made into the whole affair. May it operate as a salutary caution to those who want to go into lawless places to puzzle. Okay. So, what a heck of a calamity. Anyway, that's John Bailey. Now, after being granted a pardon by Smith, he had to start a new life. In May 1848, John Bailey was appointed supervisor to a new experimental project in Natal, the Natal Cotton Company plantation on the Umhloti River. This project was a disaster from the start, and he was dismissed in January 1849. I can't find any reference to disgrace. It was just falling apart. He established himself then as a general agent in Durban. This is a picture of Durban in 1852. There's a few houses and pondocks there, and that's what Durban looked like then. So, as I say, different times completely. But so what did Bailey do next? In 1852, he purchased and fitted out a small yacht, the Haidee. Somewhere I read that this was a lifeboat of a 1820 settler ship of the same name. In June, he set out on an exploratory voyage with a cargo of trade goods. He entered the Mgazi River and satisfactorily bartered her cargo for gum. Now, this is not the Mgazi River, this is the Mgazana River, which is a much bigger mouth. And the Mgazana River is in the middle distance. This beach here is all sanded up. Now and again, after a flood, a small ski boat can get into the Mgazi River, but I don't know what it looked like 200 years ago. And this is a very special place. This is where my roots are, and Bailey was there. Can you believe it? Okay. So, back in paradise for old Bailey. On the return voyage, the Haidee encountered the Hector, a London bark in distress, leaking. Bailey and his crew boarded the Hector to assist at the pumps. The Hector was foundering and was run ashore. The Haidee, with only captain and one crew, made for Durban. The Hector's captain and most of the crew reached the shore safely. Bailey and 5 hands were trapped on the wreck and drowned. So, his death was heroic. Bailey's assets were inadequate to meet the expenses of the Hades voyage. His estate was declared insolvent. He died intestate. A lawyer died intestate. And appears, and this to me is the greatest tragedy of John Bailey, and appears to have broken off all contact with his family by the time of his death in 1852. Mrs. Amelia Bailey died in Grahamstown in 1864. And now you know some background to that road you travel up and down to go and watch cricket. That's John Bailey. Thank you. for listening patiently.
Are there any questions?
Yes. When the murder took place, or the killing, or whatever, he relates there that he took 200 sovereigns, or counted out 200 sovereigns, but then signed a receipt for 1,500 or 2,000. Is that Rix dollars?
Yeah.
Now, I'm just a bit curious as to why, unless it's journalistic license, they're talking about sovereigns, and the next sentence they're talking about a different type of currency. It doesn't quite gel.
I tried very hard to read that and try and picture it. And 1 minute they're standing outside and then they're going into the house and outside the house again, and it's confusing. And I don't know. I really don't know. There's not more evidence. Maybe it's Bob Godwin trying to pump up the flaws in the whole story. But whatever, I don't know who the judge was, but he found it guilty. And
What was the currency? No, in the area, what did people deal with?
I think Rix dollars was still
Oh, euro.
probably in circulation, but very much after 18, when did the British come back? 10. It was sovereigns, British sovereigns. Rix dollars were poor currency, but there would have been lots of overlap. So both.
So it's
lots
quite
of
feasible that there was
Yeah,
a deal with.
There must have been, I suppose.
Any idea what the conversion between the two
Oh,
was? Is it possible that the one related to the other and the other in the opposite currency?
Well, one thing is that 2,000 Rix dollars were worth about 200 sovereigns.
So I guess that's exactly what it was.
Rates
It
decline.
does sound like.
Comparison with the rates decline. Going great, by the way.
But now, I'm sorry to present all this horrible, ugly news to you. It's not such fun river after all. But, reading it again, Margaret Rayner didn't shy away from that. She mentions that he was sentenced to death and reprieved. And the only thing really that I've got new is the Grahamstown Journal. It is a bit tedious and boring, but it illustrates, you can feel it was drama in the papers. Godwin was also selling papers. But he was also one of the big people, very influential parliamentarian, and stirring the governors and saying, when are you going to release this guy? He's a good man, he's a good man. Persistently. And Maitland and Pottinger said, looked elsewhere. Harry Smith said, what?
Thank you so much for your talk and your questions if you have. And thank you for the in-depth journey of John Bailey. It's really interesting and it makes you wonder.